"Excuse me, but the staff entrance is in the back." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cold as icicles. My own daughter, Sarah, stared at me with not even a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as wedding guests turned to look at the woman in the navy dress from Target. I stood frozen, clutching a gift I'd spent 3 months saving for, while Boston's elite whispered and stared. "I'm Emily Walker, and this is the story of how my daughter pretended I didn't exist at her own wedding, until the bill for $300,000 came due." Standing there on the marble floor of Brookfield Country Club, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been breaking slowly for 2 years. No, this was my last thread of hope snapping clean in half. You'd think after raising a child for 29 years through sleepless nights, scraped knees, and teenage heartbreak, you'd earn some basic recognition at her wedding. But here's the thing about rich people. They have a way of making you disappear while you're standing right in front of them. The woman next to Sarah, Victoria Westfield, mother of James, the groom, actually laughed. A delicate little tinkle like expensive crystal breaking. "Oh, darling," she said to my daughter, "your staff really should know better than to use the front entrance." I looked down at my navy dress, the nicest thing I owned, bought specifically for this day. At 58, I'd learned to shop clearance racks and make every dollar stretch. 3 months of overtime at the insurance office had paid for that dress, the gift, and the gas to drive here from Hartford. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, my voice somehow steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I must have made a mistake." The security guard was already moving toward me, a kind-faced man in his 50s who probably had daughters of his own. "Ma'am, if you could just—" "Of course," I interrupted. No scene. Not here. Not in front of these people who already thought I was nothing. I turned to leave, but not before I saw Sarah's face. For just 1 second, a shadow crossed her features. She knew exactly who I was. She knew, and she'd chosen to pretend otherwise. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake or some confusion about my appearance. My daughter had deliberately disowned me in front of Boston's elite. The story of how my daughter became a stranger starts 18 months earlier when she brought James Westfield home for the first time. I should have seen the warning signs then, but love makes you blind to a lot of things, especially a mother's love. "Mom, this is James," Sarah had said, her voice different somehow, cooler, more careful, like she was auditioning for a part in a play I hadn't read the script for. James was handsome in that expensive way. Perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Mrs. Walker," he'd said, "Sarah has told me so much about you." What he meant was she'd told him enough to know I was a problem to be managed. I'd cooked all afternoon for that dinner. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans from my garden. The same meal I'd made for every birthday and celebration in Sarah's life. The same meal she used to beg for when she was 8 years old and homesick at summer camp. James had picked at his food like he was afraid it might contaminate his trust fund. "This is very authentic," he'd said. That word, authentic, like I was some kind of museum exhibit. Sarah barely ate either, watching James's reaction to everything. The chipped dinner plates I'd had since her childhood, the discount store tablecloth, the framed photos of our family trips to state parks and budget motels. "Mom still has that picture from when I was 10, she'd said, laughing in a way that sounded like an apology, pointing at our Grand Canyon photo. "How quaint," Victoria Westfield had replied when she'd visited a month later. She'd said it the same way you might say, "How tragic." That was the beginning of the end. Though I didn't know it then, I thought I was watching my daughter fall in love. What I was actually watching was my daughter fall away from me, one perfectly manicured step at a time. After dinner that night, while Sarah was showing James her childhood bedroom, which she was already apologizing for as they walked up the stairs. I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, my hands deep in soapy water that was growing cold. I stared out the window at my small backyard garden, the herbs I'd planted in spring now full and fragrant in the summer evening. This house had been our sanctuary after Tom died when Sarah was just 7. My husband's life insurance had been enough for a modest down payment, and I'd worked 2 jobs for years to keep a roof over our heads. Insurance claims by day, waitressing on weekends, 22 years of sacrifice, of putting Sarah's needs before my own, of making sure she had opportunities I never did. I'd sent her to college, the first walker to get a degree. I'd helped her land her first apartment, her first job in marketing. I'd been there for every milestone, every disappointment, every triumph. But that night, washing dishes while my daughter laughed too loudly upstairs with a man who found our lives authentic, I felt the first tremor of what was to come. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was reviewing insurance claims at my kitchen table when Sarah's name lit up my phone screen. "Mom, we need to talk." Not "Hi, Mom," or "How was your day?" Just that flat, businesslike tone she'd been using more and more since James entered the picture. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" There was a pause. I could hear voices in the background, expensive voices, discussing wine vintages and stock portfolios. She was at the Westfield house again. "It's about the wedding planning. We've been thinking about the guest list, and well, some adjustments need to be made." Adjustments. I set down my pen and gave her my full attention. "What kind of adjustments?" "Nothing major," she said quickly. "It's just that James's family has certain expectations about the tone of the event. Very formal, very traditional." I waited. 40 years of being a single mother teaches you when to push and when to let silence do the work. "The thing is, Mom, your friends from work in the neighborhood might not be comfortable in that environment. It's going to be very upscale, very different from what they're used to." There it was, the knife sliding in smooth and clean. "I see. And what about your godmother, Linda? Your cousin, Patty, who drove 12 hours to help us move you to college?" "This isn't personal, Mom. It's practical. We want everyone to feel comfortable." Comfortable? Like my family and friends were some kind of embarrassment that needed to be hidden away. "How many of my guests are we talking about removing, Sarah?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Well, we've reserved 3 seats for your side. You, Aunt Carol, and maybe Mrs. Patterson from next door since she helped raise me. 3 seats. For the woman who'd raised her alone after her father died. 3 seats for the family that had loved her unconditionally for 29 years. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. Not really. "You're upset." "I'm processing." That night I sat in my living room looking at the photo albums spread across my coffee table. Every birthday party I'd thrown with dollar store decorations and homemade cake. Every school play I'd attended alone while other parents sat in couples. Every sacrifice I'd made to give her a good life. But apparently none of that was good enough for the Westfields of Boston. Meeting the Westfield family in their natural habitat was like being dropped into a nature documentary about a species I'd only read about. Their Beacon Hill mansion, and yes, they called it a mansion, not a house, had more square footage than my entire neighborhood. Victoria Westfield greeted me at the door wearing pearls the size of grapes and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Emily, how lovely to finally meet you properly." She said my name like it tasted of something she'd found stuck to her shoe. "Please, come in." "Please call me Em." Everyone does. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." Names have such importance, don't you think? They say so much about background. She led me through rooms that looked like museum displays, each one more intimidating than the last. Persian rugs that probably cost more than my annual salary. Paintings in ornate gold frames that looked like they belonged in galleries. Sarah tells us you work in insurance, Victoria said as she guided me toward the sunroom where drinks were being served. How practical. The way she said practical made it sound like a communicable disease. Claims adjustment, I clarified. I help people rebuild their lives after disasters. How noble, she murmured, steering me past oil paintings that probably cost more than my car. Richard Westfield III, because apparently being Richard Westfield I and a 2 wasn't impressive enough, barely looked up from his Wall Street Journal when we were introduced. The man had mastered the art of making you feel invisible while you were standing right in front of him. Sarah was there too, of course, but she might as well have been a different person. She wore a designer dress I'd never seen before, her hair styled in a way that made her look like she'd just stepped off the pages of a magazine. She kissed me on the cheek, a quick, practiced gesture that left no trace of lipstick. "Mom, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, but her eyes were scanning the room, making sure everyone noticed she'd done her duty by including me. The real fun started at dinner. They'd arranged the seating so I was between James's great-aunt Constance, who was 90 and mostly deaf, and his cousin Trevor, who was 35 and mostly drunk. "So, Emily," Richard said over the soup course, a cold cucumber concoction that seemed designed to be as flavorless as possible. "Sarah mentioned you raised her alone. That must have been quite challenging." The word challenging hung in the air like smoke from a fire they were politely pretending not to smell. "It had its moments," I replied, "but we managed just fine." "Oh, I'm sure you did your best," Victoria added with that smile again. "Single motherhood is so common these days, though. Of course, children do benefit from having proper guidance." Trevor snorted into his wine. "Mother means money, Emily. Children benefit from having money." Even Sarah looked uncomfortable then, but she didn't say anything. That silence spoke louder than any words could have. "Fortunately," Richard continued, "James can provide the stability that's been lacking." That's when I understood this wasn't just about money or social class. This was about erasing me entirely, replacing my 29 years of love and sacrifice with their version of what a proper family should look like. But they weren't done with me yet. "Sarah tells us you work in insurance fraud," Victoria said, her voice dropping slightly as if she were discussing something distasteful. "That must be interesting." 20 years of it," I said. "You'd be surprised what people try to get away with." Something flickered across Richard's face, so brief I almost missed it. A tightening around the eyes, perhaps, or a slight tensing of the jaw. "I imagine most of those people are rather desperate," he said carefully. "Not always," I replied. "Some of the most sophisticated fraud schemes I've uncovered involved very wealthy individuals, people who didn't need the money, but felt entitled to it anyway." The silence that followed was thick enough to slice with the silver butter knives resting beside our fine china plates. "More wine, anyone?" Sarah interjected, her voice unnaturally bright. As the evening progressed, I watched my daughter navigate this new world with the determination of someone who'd been studying the rulebook in secret. She laughed at inside jokes I couldn't possibly understand, referenced vacation spots I'd never heard of, and discussed people whose names sounded like they belonged in history books rather than dinner conversations. By dessert, a deconstructed something or other that looked more like abstract art than food, I felt completely out of place, as if I'd wandered into the wrong dinner party and everyone was too polite to tell me to leave. "Sarah mentioned you're living in the same house she grew up in," Victoria said as the staff, and yes, there was staff, served coffee in delicate porcelain cups. "How consistent of you." "It's home," I said simply. "It holds a lot of memories." "Oh, but don't you ever want something new?" she pressed. "I can't imagine staying in one place for so long." "We renovate every few years just to keep things fresh." I thought of my small 3-bedroom Cape Cod-style house, with its creaking floorboards and the doorframe where I'd marked Sarah's height every year. The kitchen where I'd taught her to bake cookies. The backyard where we'd planted a tree when she was 10, now tall enough to shade half the yard. Some things are worth keeping, I said. Sarah didn't look at me. In the months that followed, Sarah's transformation accelerated. She changed her hairstyle, her clothes, even the way she spoke, adopting the slightly bored tone of someone who has never had to worry about money. The wedding planning became a series of carefully orchestrated exclusions. Each call from Sarah brought news of another decision made without my input, another tradition modified to suit the Westfields' preferences. "Mom, about the mother-daughter dance," Sarah said during one of her increasingly rare visits. "The Westfields have this tradition where the groom's mother joins halfway through. It's been in their family for generations." "That's fine, honey," I said, though it wasn't. "We can share the dance." She fidgeted with her engagement ring, a diamond so large it looked like costume jewelry to my eyes. "Actually, we're thinking of skipping it altogether. The schedule is already so packed, and James's father wants to make this really long toast." One by one, the moments I'd dreamed about since she was a little girl disappeared from the wedding plans. No getting ready together on the morning of the ceremony. No helping her into her dress. No walking her down the aisle. I'd always assumed I would, since her father wasn't here to do it. Instead, I was given a list of approved outfit colors. Navy or dusty rose, Mom. Nothing bright. A specific time to arrive at the venue. Not too early, they'll still be setting up. And instructions about where to sit. We've arranged seating by family connections. Meanwhile, Sarah's social media told the story of a different wedding altogether. There she was at her bridal shower, surrounded by Westfield women in designer dresses. There she was at her bachelorette weekend in the Hamptons, laughing with friends I'd never met. There she was at the rehearsal dinner I hadn't been invited to, toasting with champagne that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. The captions never mentioned me. It was as if she'd sprung fully formed into this new life, with no history before James, no mother who had sacrificed everything to give her the foundation she'd used to climb into this rarefied world. One evening, scrolling through these images with a glass of wine in hand, I noticed something else. In her About section on Facebook, Sarah had changed her hometown from Hartford to Boston, where she'd moved after college. She'd erased not just me, but the entire history of where she came from. I set down my phone and stared out the window at the darkening sky. The magnolia tree Tom and I had planted when we first bought this house was in full bloom, its pale pink flowers luminous in the twilight. Sarah had climbed that tree as a child, fallen from it once and broken her arm. I'd held her in the emergency room while they set the bone, whispering stories in her ear to distract her from the pain. Now she was pretending that none of it had ever happened. The final blow came 2 weeks before the wedding, when Sarah called to confirm arrangements. "Mom, about the seating at the reception," she began, her voice already telling me I wouldn't like what came next. "The head table is just going to be James and me, his parents, and the wedding party." "I understand," I said, though I didn't. In what world does the mother of the bride not sit at the head table? "You'll be at table 23 with Aunt Carol and Mrs. Patterson." Table 23. I later learned there were 25 tables total. "And Mom, the Westfields have hired a car service for all the out-of-town guests, but since you're driving in from Hartford..." "I'll drive myself, don't worry about it." There was a pause on the line. "It's going to be beautiful, Mom. I just want everything to be perfect." Perfect. What she meant was perfectly aligned with what the Westfields expected. Perfectly designed to hide the embarrassing parts of her history. Me. "I'm sure it will be," I said. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the invitation that had arrived in the mail weeks earlier. Thick cream cardstock with gold lettering announcing the wedding of Sarah Elizabeth Walker and James Richard Westfield IV. My daughter's name looked strange printed in that fancy script, next to his name with its succession of generations behind it. I traced my finger over the embossed letters, remembering the little girl who used to practice writing her name over and over, forming each letter with careful concentration. The teenager who decided to sign everything SEW for a year because she thought it sounded more sophisticated. The young woman who'd proudly ordered her first business cards after landing her marketing job, bringing one home to stick on our refrigerator. Now her name was about to change, to be absorbed into a dynasty that had no room for her past. I opened my laptop and did what any insurance investigator would do when something didn't feel right. I started digging. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and drizzling, which seemed appropriate for what was about to become the worst day of my life. I'd woken up at 5:00 a.m. with stomach cramps that had nothing to do with the toast I couldn't force down. My navy dress hung on the closet door like a flag of surrender. 3 months of overtime for a dress that cost less than what Victoria probably spent on lunch, but it was clean, pressed, and dignified. It was the best I could do. I took special care with my appearance that day, applying makeup with a steady hand, styling my graying hair into a simple updo. If I was going to be judged by these people, I would at least give them less ammunition. The drive to Boston took longer than expected, rain and weekend traffic conspiring to increase my anxiety. By the time I pulled into the Brookfield Country Club parking lot, I was running 15 minutes later than I'd planned, though still well before the ceremony was set to begin. The country club was everything I'd expected, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers and staff who'd clearly been trained to spot people who didn't belong from 50 yards away. I parked my 12-year-old Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling like I was contaminating the parking lot. Inside, the lobby buzzed with pre-wedding energy. Women in designer dresses that cost more than my monthly rent kissed air near each other's cheeks. Men in tailored suits discussed golf handicaps and market portfolios. I stood near the gift table, clutching my present, a hand-carved maple jewelry box I'd found at an antique shop in Hartford. The wood was warm and golden, with tiny roses carved into the lid. I'd spent weeks looking for something that felt special enough for my daughter's wedding day. "Oh my," I heard Victoria's voice before I saw her. She was talking to a cluster of women, her voice carrying just far enough for me to catch the words. "Such an interesting mix of guests today. Sarah has such a generous heart, including everyone." The way she said everyone made it clear exactly who she was talking about. I pretended to study the gift table, reading name tags on elaborately wrapped packages from Tiffany and Cartier. My antique jewelry box looked modest beside them, but it was chosen with love, which had to count for something. That's when Sarah appeared, floating down the marble staircase in her wedding dress like something from a fairy tale. She was beautiful. My baby girl all grown up, radiant with happiness. For a moment my heart swelled with pride and love. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep every night, the teenager I'd helped through heartbreak, the young woman I'd cheered through college graduation. Then she saw me, and that's when I watched my daughter's face go completely blank, like someone had just erased every memory of the woman who'd raised her. The transformation was subtle but complete. I watched Sarah's posture change, her chin lifting slightly, her eyes sliding past me like I was part of the wallpaper. She'd been practicing this moment, I realized. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was calculated. "Sarah, darling," Victoria appeared at her side, air-kissing her new daughter-in-law. "You look absolutely radiant. Everyone is so excited." They moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting congratulations and compliments. I stayed by the gift table, still holding my present, watching my daughter charm people who wouldn't have given me the time of day. "Ma'am," a young server appeared at my elbow. The ceremony is about to begin. Would you like me to show you to your seat? Yes, please. She led me through the crowd, past clusters of Westfield family and friends, toward the back of the room. My seat was in the last row, behind a pillar that partially blocked the view of the altar. Row after row of Westfields and their society friends filled the front section. 3 chairs in the back corner held the representation of my entire side of the family. Me, my sister Carol, who'd driven down from Vermont, and Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who'd practically helped raise Sarah. "Well," Carol whispered as she sat down beside me, "this is cozy. Leave it to my sister to find humor in humiliation." She took in the scene with the sharp eye of a woman who'd spent 40 years teaching middle school. "Did you see the gift table?" she asked quietly. "There's a present there from the governor of Massachusetts." "Really?" "Also one from some British lord whose name I can't pronounce." The string quartet began playing, and everyone stood as the processional started. Bridesmaids in matching dusty rose dresses glided down the aisle, followed by the flower girl, James's niece, a tiny blonde thing who scattered rose petals like she was blessing the ground. Then came Sarah, walking alone down the aisle. Her father had died when she was 7, and I'd always assumed I would walk her down the aisle, or at least that she'd walk alone in his memory. But as she passed our row, I caught her eye for just a moment. There was something there, a flicker of recognition, maybe even regret, but it vanished so quickly I might have imagined it. The ceremony was beautiful and cold, full of readings about tradition and family legacy. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the marriage, a nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. I stayed silent, of course, but in that moment I wondered what would happen if I stood up and said, "I object to my daughter pretending I don't exist." Instead, I watched her promise to love and honor a man whose family had just spent 6 months systematically erasing me from her life. And then they were married, and it was time for the reception. That's when the real humiliation began. The cocktail hour was where the Westfield family really showed their teeth. I'd barely entered the reception area when a woman in a silver dress and enough diamonds to fund a small country approached me with a smile that could freeze champagne. "You must be Emily," she said, though we'd never been introduced. Word travels fast in rich people circles, apparently. "I'm Margaret Ashworth, Victoria's sister. I understand you're helping with the service today." Helping with the service? Not the mother of the bride, not even a guest. The woman actually thought I was working the wedding. "Actually, I'm—" "Oh, wonderful," she interrupted, pressing an empty champagne flute into my hands. "Could you be a dear and get me another? The Dom Perignon, not the regular champagne. I can tell the difference." I stood there holding her glass like an idiot while she fluttered away to rejoin her cluster of society friends. Around me, the reception hummed with laughter and conversation. Crystal glasses clinked. Designer heels clicked across marble floors, and nobody seemed to notice that the mother of the bride was being treated like the help. Well, almost nobody. "Ma'am?" A real server approached me, confused. She was a college-aged girl with kind eyes and the harried look of someone working 3 jobs to pay for school. "Are you okay? You look a little lost." "Just finding my bearings," I replied, setting down the champagne flute on a nearby table decorated with white orchids that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The server glanced around nervously, checking to make sure her supervisor wasn't watching. "I don't mean to be rude, but my supervisor mentioned there might be some confusion about staff today. Are you supposed to be working this event?" Even the actual staff could tell I didn't belong with the guests. That's when the full scope of my daughter's betrayal hit me like a freight train carrying pure humiliation. She hadn't just excluded my friends and family from her wedding. She'd arranged for me to be mistaken for hired help. The woman I'd raised alone, put through college while working 2 jobs, loved unconditionally for 29 years, had orchestrated my public humiliation down to the smallest detail. "No, honey," I said gently, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not working. I'm the bride's mother." The girl's eyes widened in horror. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Mrs. Westfield told us that all the family was seated at the head table. So when I saw you back here—" She trailed off, realizing she was making it worse. Mrs. Westfield. My daughter was already Mrs. Westfield, and she'd made sure everyone knew that the family worth acknowledging was sitting at the front of the room in their designer gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos. "It's not your fault," I assured the server. "What's your name?" "Maya," she said, still mortified. "Maya Johnson." "Well, Maya, it seems like there's been some miscommunication all around today." That was putting it mildly. What had happened today wasn't miscommunication. It was character assassination. "Can I get you anything, Mrs. Walker? A drink? Some appetizers?" The kindness in her voice nearly broke me. Here was this young woman, probably earning minimum wage plus tips, showing me more respect than my own daughter had. "Just a glass of water would be nice, Maya. Thank you." As she hurried away, I saw Sarah across the room laughing at something James whispered in her ear. She looked radiant, happy, completely unburdened by the fact that she'd just erased the woman who'd given her life. Her dress probably cost more than I made in 6 months, and she wore it like armor against her past. But I'd been underestimating my daughter, apparently, because as I watched her navigate that crowd of sharks in designer clothing, I realized she'd been planning this humiliation for months. Every excluded friend, every reduced guest list, every calculated slight. It had all been building to this moment where I would stand in a corner, invisible and irrelevant, while she began her new life as someone who'd never had a mother at all. The worst part? She was good at it. My little girl, who used to cry when she accidentally stepped on ants, had become a master manipulator who could destroy someone's dignity without even blinking. But she'd forgotten one important thing about the woman who raised her. I didn't give up easily, and I'd been dealing with people who thought they were smarter than me for 40 years. Maya returned with my water, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being seen talking to me. "Mrs. Walker, I feel terrible about what happened," she whispered. "Is there anything I can do?" I was about to thank her and send her on her way when something occurred to me. In 20 years of investigating insurance fraud, I'd learned that the people who see everything are the ones nobody notices: the cleaning staff, the maintenance workers, the servers at fancy events. "Actually, Maya, there is." I took a sip of my water. "How long have you been working here at Brookfield?" "About 2 years. I work weekends and holidays to help pay for school." She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I'm studying forensic accounting at Boston University." Forensic accounting. Now there was an interesting coincidence. "Do you work many Westfield events?" Her eyes widened slightly. "They have something here almost every month. Charity galas, business dinners, golf tournaments. They're big donors to the club." "And have you noticed anything unusual about their events?" Maya hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I shouldn't really talk about the clients." "Of course," I said, taking another sip of water. "I understand. Professional discretion is important." She seemed relieved, but then glanced around again and leaned closer. "It's just, there was this weird thing last month, at Mr. Richard Westfield's birthday celebration." I waited, giving her space to continue on her own terms. "They had this private dinner in the Hemingway room, just family and really close business associates. I was serving drinks and I overheard Mr. Westfield talking about some SEC investigation and how they needed to be careful about paper trails." My investigator instincts perked up immediately. The Securities and Exchange Commission didn't investigate people for jaywalking. "That is unusual," I agreed, keeping my voice casual. "Did they mention anything specific about this investigation?" Maya shook her head. "Not really, but after dinner they moved to the library for cigars and brandy. The women, too, which was weird. And they had these folders they were all looking at. Very hush-hush. When I came in with the brandy tray, they shut them all really quick. Interesting. And then last week, when they were here for the rehearsal dinner, I overheard Mr. James talking to someone about cleaning up loose ends before the wedding. He seemed really stressed about it. Maya glanced at her watch and grimaced. I have to get back to work. The dinner service starts soon. Of course. Thank you, Maya. You've been very kind. As she hurried away, I turned the information over in my mind. An SEC investigation, paper trails, cleaning up loose ends before the wedding. It could be nothing. Rich people were always worried about something threatening their money, but my fraud investigator radar was pinging loudly. I scanned the room, locating the exits and hallways that led deeper into the country club. If there was something going on with the Westfields, something that might explain why they'd been so determined to keep me at arm's length, perhaps there was evidence somewhere in this building. After all, they clearly saw this place as a second home. And people tend to get comfortable in their second homes, sometimes too comfortable. Dinner was announced with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for royal coronations. The head table gleamed with gold-rimmed china and crystal that probably cost more than my car. Sarah sat there like a princess holding court, accepting congratulations from a parade of well-wishers who treated her like she'd just solved world hunger instead of marrying into money. I found my assigned seat at a small table tucked behind a massive potted palm in the far corner of the room, practically hidden from view. The location was so remote it might as well have had its own zip code. My table mates were an interesting mix of the discarded and the dismissed. The photographer's assistant, two elderly cousins who'd apparently been deemed too embarrassing for prime seating, and a +1 whose date had abandoned her for better company. "Well, this is cozy," one of the elderly cousins muttered, adjusting her hearing aid and squinting at the distance to the head table. "I haven't been stuck at the reject table since your Uncle Fred's second wedding. At least then they gave us decent dinner rolls." As the salad course was being served, some pretentious arrangement of microgreens and goat cheese that looked like it had been assembled with tweezers, I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead of heading toward the ladies' room, I slipped down a hallway marked Private, Staff Only. Years of claims investigation had taught me that people are creatures of habit. If the Westfields use this country club regularly for family business, they probably use the same private rooms each time. The hallway was quiet, the sounds of the reception fading behind me. I passed a series of doors with small plaques: Rose Room, Oak Room, and finally Hemingway Room, the one Maya had mentioned. I tried the handle. Locked. Of course it would be. "Looking for something?" a voice asked behind me. I turned to find an older man in the uniform of the club staff, his name tag reading George. "Just looking for the ladies' room," I added, offering an embarrassed smile. I seemed to have taken a wrong turn. George studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the hallway I'd just come down. "Back that way, second right." "Thank you." As I turned to leave, he added, "You're the bride's mother, aren't you?" I paused, surprised to be recognized. "Yes." His expression softened. "I've worked here 30 years, ma'am, seen all kinds of weddings. Some people forget where they come from when they marry up. Doesn't mean they don't remember, deep down." There was something in his eyes, sympathy mixed with something else. Knowledge, perhaps. "The Westfields have been members here a long time?" I asked. 3 generations, he confirmed. "I knew Richard's father. Cut from the same cloth, those two." "And what kind of cloth is that?" George glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "The kind that looks fine from a distance but starts to unravel when you get up close." He paused. "If you're really looking for something, you might try the business center. Second floor, end of the hall. The key code is 1922. Before I could respond, he nodded politely and continued down the hallway. The business center was easy enough to find, A small room with computers, printers, and a few desks, clearly designed for members who couldn't bear to be away from work, even during a round of golf. At this hour, with the wedding reception in full swing, it was deserted. I entered the key code, 1922, and the door unlocked with a soft click. Inside, I went straight to the computer nearest the window and turned it on. While waiting for it to boot up, I glanced around the room. A printer, a fax machine, a shredder, all standard office equipment. But on one of the desks was a leather portfolio with the Westfield Company logo embossed in gold. Someone had been working here recently and left in a hurry. I opened the portfolio and found exactly what I was looking for. Financial documents, including insurance claims from 3 different companies, all bearing James's signature in his distinctive handwriting. Claims for property damage from accidents that had happened at suspiciously convenient times, always just before major financial obligations came due. There was the boat fire that happened 2 days before James's business loan payment was due. The car accident that totaled his BMW exactly when his credit card bills reached their maximum limits. The apartment flood that coincidentally occurred right before he needed money for Sarah's engagement ring. Each incident perfectly timed, each claim just large enough to cover his immediate financial needs. 20 years of fraud investigation teaches you to recognize patterns that innocent people would dismiss as bad luck. And James Westfield had a very interesting pattern of expensive accidents that always seemed to solve his money problems at exactly the right moment. As I read through the documents, pieces began falling into place. The SEC investigation Richard had mentioned, I'd bet my pension it was related to these convenient accidents and the complex web of shell companies they'd mentioned. And I'd bet my life savings that the Westfields' sudden urgency to keep me away from their family gatherings had everything to do with my professional expertise in recognizing insurance fraud. My daughter thought she was marrying into wealth and security, joining a family that would give her the sophisticated lifestyle she'd always craved. What she'd actually done was become an accessory to a federal crime, probably without even realizing it. But ignorance wouldn't protect her when the FBI finished their investigation, and it certainly wouldn't protect her from the consequences of humiliating the one person who might have been able to help her navigate the legal nightmare she just walked into. I took my phone from my purse and carefully photographed each document, making sure to capture the signatures, dates, and claim amounts clearly. Then I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it and left the business center, making sure the door locked behind me. As I made my way back to the reception, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The hurt and humiliation were still there, but they'd been joined by something else: certainty. I now understood the Westfields' game, and more importantly, I understood the risks my daughter had unknowingly taken by aligning herself with them. I had spent my entire adult life protecting Sarah. Even now, after everything she'd done today, my first instinct was to shield her from what was coming. But I also knew that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their child face the consequences of their choices. The question was, what was I going to do with this information? I returned to my table just as the main course was being served. Some artistic arrangement of steak and vegetables that probably cost more than a week's groceries. My table mates barely noticed my absence, too busy straining to hear the toasts being given at the head table. Harrison Westfield III stood to make the first toast, tapping his crystal glass with a sterling silver knife that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His voice carried easily across the room, trained by years of boardroom presentations and country club speeches. Today we celebrate not just a marriage, but the joining of 2 families with shared values and traditions. James and Sarah represent the best of what young people can achieve when they're raised with proper guidance and support. Shared values. I almost choked on my water. What values would those be? The importance of money over loyalty? The art of pretending inconvenient people don't exist? The belief that love can be purchased with the right wedding venue and enough champagne. Proper guidance. 29 years of single motherhood apparently didn't qualify as proper guidance. All those nights I'd stayed up helping with homework. All those soccer games I'd attended alone while other parents sat in couples. All those sacrifices I'd made to give her opportunities I'd never had. None of that counted as guidance in Richard Westfield's world. The speech continued with platitudes about tradition and legacy. Words that sounded pretty, but meant nothing when you stripped away the fancy packaging. I watched the guests nod approvingly, sipping their expensive wine and mentally calculating the cost of the flower arrangements. The photographer moved between tables, capturing candid moments of joy and celebration. When she reached my table, she paused, checking her notes with a confused expression. "Excuse me, are you Dorothy Williams?" "Emily Walker," I corrected. "The bride's mother." She looked genuinely puzzled, glancing back at her notes and then toward the head table where the official family was seated. "I was told by the wedding planner that there would be no family photos from the bride's side, just the Westfield family portraits." No family photos. My daughter had made sure that her wedding album would contain no evidence that I'd ever existed. Future generations of Westfields would flip through beautiful pictures of this day and never know that the bride had been raised by a woman who'd loved her enough to work 2 jobs and give up her own dreams so Sarah could have everything she wanted. "I see," I said calmly, though inside I felt something cold and sharp settling in my chest. "Well, perhaps you could take one quick photo of our table. For the record." The photographer smiled sympathetically and raised her camera. As the flash went off, I thought about all the photos that would be missing from this wedding. No mother-daughter getting ready shots. No tearful moments of a mother helping her daughter into her dress. No traditional family portraits showing 3 generations of women. No mother-daughter dance where I would have told her how proud I was of the woman she'd become. Sarah had choreographed my elimination so completely that future generations of Westfield would never know she'd had a mother at all. In her version of history, she'd apparently been raised by wolves or spontaneously generated from pure ambition. After dinner, I excused myself again, needing a moment alone to process everything I'd learned. I found a quiet hallway with a bench near a window overlooking the golf course, misty in the evening rain. That's when I heard voices coming from a nearby room, the door slightly ajar. Familiar voices having what sounded like a very private conversation. "It's absolutely crucial that there's no connection visible to anyone looking from the outside," Richard was saying, his voice tight with stress. "The SEC investigation is still ongoing, and they're specifically looking for patterns in our social circle." My feet stopped moving. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding. "Daddy, you're being paranoid," I heard James reply, though his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. "Nobody's going to trace anything back to the family trust. The shell companies are clean. The wedding guest list alone would raise questions if anyone looked closely enough," Richard continued. "That's why we needed to keep certain people away from this event, people with the wrong kind of professional background." My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't about social embarrassment or class differences. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. "What about Emily?" Victoria's voice was sharp with the kind of anxiety that comes from knowing you're in deep trouble. "She could be a real problem if she starts asking the right questions. Her job makes her exactly the type of person we can't have sniffing around." "She won't be a problem." Sarah's voice made my heart stop completely. "Trust me, Mother. I know exactly how to handle her. She's so desperate for my approval that she'll believe whatever I tell her." Mother. My daughter was calling Victoria Westfield Mother with the same tone she'd once used for me. And she was talking about me like I was a stray dog that needed to be managed. "Good," Richard continued, his voice carrying the cold calculation of a man used to making problems disappear. The less she knows about James's business arrangements, the better for everyone involved. A claims adjuster with her experience would recognize financial irregularities immediately if she saw the right documents. That's when the pieces clicked into place like tumblers in a lock opening to reveal something ugly hidden inside. My profession wasn't just embarrassing to them, it was genuinely dangerous. I'd spent 20 years investigating insurance fraud, following complex paper trails, connecting dots that others missed, building cases that sent criminals to federal prison. And apparently there were dots here that the Westfield family desperately didn't want connected by someone with my particular skill set. I slipped away from the door before anyone could discover me, my mind racing with everything I'd just heard. Finding a quiet corner in the empty library of the country club, I sat down in a leather chair and tried to steady my breathing. The evidence was clear. The Westfields were involved in insurance fraud, systematic, calculated fraud that had likely been going on for years. James was filing false claims to fund his lifestyle. Richard was using shell companies to hide the money. And my daughter, whether she realized it or not, had become entangled in their criminal enterprise. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos I'd taken of the documents. The pattern was unmistakable to someone with my training. Each accident coincided perfectly with a financial need. The documentation was too clean, too convenient. In legitimate claims, there's always something messy, a detail that doesn't quite fit, a timing that's slightly off. These were textbook examples of carefully orchestrated fraud. And now I had to decide what to do with this information. Part of me, the hurt mother who'd just been publicly disowned by her only child, wanted to march straight to the head table and expose everything I'd discovered, to watch their perfect facade crumble in front of all their high society friends, to make Sarah face the consequences of choosing these criminals over her own mother. But another part of me, the part that had tucked her in every night for years and kissed every scraped knee, wanted to protect her. Even now, even after everything, my first instinct was to shield my daughter. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I would confront them, but I would do it my way, methodically and with evidence, just as I'd been trained to do in my career. First, I needed to make sure my documentation was secure. I sent the photos to my personal email with an encrypted attachment. Then I sent a copy to my work email as a backup. Next, I needed professional backup. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Daniel Harris, FBI agent. We'd worked together on several major fraud cases over the years, and I trusted him completely. It was late, but this couldn't wait. I stepped onto a balcony overlooking the golf course to make the call. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and damp. In the distance, I could see the lights of Boston glowing against the night sky. "Emily?" Daniel's voice sounded surprised when he answered. "Everything okay? It's almost midnight." "I need your help, Dan," I said quietly. "I've stumbled onto something big. Insurance fraud, securities fraud, possibly money laundering, and it involves the Westfield family." "The Westfields?" He let out a low whistle. "That's a big fish. Where are you?" "At my daughter's wedding. She just married James Westfield IV. "Jesus, Emily, are you sure about this?" "I've got documentation. Multiple fraudulent claims filed by James, all timed perfectly to cover financial needs. And I overheard Richard Westfield talking about an SEC investigation and shell companies." "The SEC has had eyes on Richard Westfield for months," Dan confirmed, his voice turning professional. "But we haven't had enough to move on him yet." "Well, I think I just found your missing piece." I explained what I'd discovered in the business center, the pattern of claims, and the conversation I'd overheard. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Dan said. "I need to call this in. Can you send me those photos now?" "On their way," I said, forwarding the encrypted files to his secure work email. What happens next? Normally we'd move immediately, but given the circumstances, he paused. It's your daughter's wedding, Emily. If you want, we can wait until tomorrow to make the arrests. Give her one night of happiness before everything falls apart. I thought about Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress, calling Victoria mother while plotting to keep me away from her new family. I thought about the way she'd looked right through me in the reception hall, pretending I was a stranger. But I also thought about the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd cried on my shoulder after her first breakup, the young woman who'd called me first when she got her dream job. Tomorrow is fine, I said finally. But I need one favor. I want to be the one to tell them what's coming. I want to see their faces when they realize who they've been trying to get rid of. That's not standard procedure, Emily, Dan warned. I'm not asking to make the arrest, just to have my moment of truth before you come in. They've spent months erasing me from my daughter's life. I need to reclaim my place in this story. There was a long pause. Then, okay, the reception should be winding down around 1 a.m. Wait until tomorrow morning, around 10. That gives us time to get everything in order. You can confront them at the post-wedding brunch and we'll arrive by 11 to make the arrests. But Emily, be careful. People who've been getting away with fraud for this long can be unpredictable when cornered. I understand. I ended the call and stood on the balcony a moment longer, watching the distant lights of the city. For the first time since arriving at this wedding, I felt something like peace. Not happiness. The situation was too tragic for that. But a sense of purpose, of rightness. I had spent my career helping people who had been wronged. Now, I would help my daughter, even if she didn't want my help, even if she couldn't see that she needed it. I returned to the reception just as the band was announcing the last dance. Sarah and James swayed in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by their guests. She looked happy, genuinely happy. And for a moment I let myself wonder if there was any possibility she didn't know what she'd gotten herself into. That maybe she'd been manipulated by the Westfields just as surely as I had been pushed aside. But then I remembered her voice, cold and calculating. Trust me, Mother. I know exactly how to handle her. As the music ended and guests began to gather their things, I slipped out quietly. No one noticed the mother of the bride leaving early. No one would miss me at the grand send-off, where I imagined Sarah and James would exit through a shower of rose petals or sparklers, climbing into some vintage luxury car to be whisked away to their honeymoon. I drove back to my hotel, a modest chain hotel 20 minutes from the country club, the best I could afford, and prepared for what would come next. I barely slept that night, rehearsing in my mind what I would say when I faced the Westfields and Sarah the next morning. By dawn, I was showered, dressed, and ready, wearing the same navy dress from the wedding. It seemed appropriate somehow to wear the same outfit for both the wedding and its aftermath. The post-wedding brunch was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. at the country club's lakeside restaurant. According to the invitation, which had arrived as an afterthought, I was sure, it was for family and close friends, a category I apparently barely qualified for. I arrived at 9:15, purposely early. The room was being set up by staff, Maya among them, who caught my eye and gave me a small, confused smile. The tables were arranged in a U-shape, with a center table clearly designated for the newlyweds and their parents. To my surprise, there was a place card with my name at this center table. Perhaps someone had realized that excluding the mother of the bride from the family table 2 days in a row might raise questions even among the socially oblivious. I took my seat and waited, watching as the room slowly filled with guests. Most looked slightly hungover, moving more slowly than they had the day before, helping themselves to coffee from silver urns arranged along a buffet table. The Westfields arrived as a unit, Richard and Victoria, James and Sarah, all looking fresh and impeccable despite the previous night's celebration. They faltered slightly when they saw me already seated at the family table, but recovered quickly, professional smiles sliding into place. "Emily," Victoria said, her voice carrying just the right note of surprise. "How lovely to see you so bright and early." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, smiling pleasantly. "After all, this is a family celebration." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps sensing something different in my demeanor. Gone was the hurt, humiliated mother from yesterday. In her place sat a woman with purpose, with knowledge. Breakfast was served: smoked salmon, poached eggs, delicate pastries. I ate little, focusing instead on the conversation flowing around me. Light, meaningless chatter about the wedding, compliments on the food, the flowers, the music. No one addressed me directly, but I didn't mind. I was waiting for the right moment. It came as coffee was being served, and Richard was preparing to make yet another toast. The room had filled completely now, with perhaps 30 people, the innermost circle of the Westfield world. "Before you begin, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the table, "I have something I'd like to say." The conversation around us died. All eyes turned to me, some curious, some wary, most simply surprised that I was speaking at all. "Of course, Emily," Richard said, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though traditionally I believe the father of the groom—" "Yes, traditions are important," I interrupted smoothly, "like the tradition of honesty between family members, or the tradition of respecting those who came before you." A tense silence fell over the table. I could see Sarah's knuckles whitening as she gripped her coffee cup. "I've spent the past day being systematically erased from my daughter's life," I continued, my voice steady. "Seated behind pillars, mistaken for staff, excluded from photographs. And I've been trying to understand why. What could possibly justify treating the woman who raised Sarah alone for 22 years with such calculated cruelty?" Victoria made a small, dismissive gesture. "Emily, this is hardly the time—" "It's exactly the time," I cut in, "because yesterday I discovered the truth. And it had nothing to do with my social status or my discount store clothes or my insurance industry job, at least not in the way I thought." I reached into my purse and removed my phone, placing it on the table in front of me. "You see, my specific job, investigating insurance fraud, made me uniquely dangerous to this family, because I can look at a series of convenient accidents and see the pattern that others might miss. I can recognize when claims are too perfect, too timely, too convenient." The color drained from James's face. Richard went very still. Victoria's hand fluttered to her throat, fingers closing around her pearl necklace. "I don't know what you think you found," Richard began, his voice low and warning. "But I assure you—" "What I found," I said, turning my phone toward them so they could see the screen displaying one of the insurance claims, "was evidence of systematic fraud. The boat fire 2 days before James's business loan payment was due. The car accident that coincidentally totaled his BMW right when his credit card bills maxed out. The apartment flood that happened just in time to fund Sarah's engagement ring." I looked directly at my daughter now. "Did you know, Sarah? Did you know that the diamond on your finger was paid for by a fraudulent insurance claim? Did you know that you were marrying into a family of criminals?" "That's enough," Richard snapped, half rising from his chair. "I don't know what game you're playing, but these are serious allegations that you cannot substantiate." "Actually, I can," I replied calmly. "I've sent copies of all these documents to the FBI. They're very interested, especially since they dovetail so nicely with an ongoing SEC investigation into the Westfield family's financial dealings." The room had gone completely silent. Even the staff had stopped moving, frozen in place by the tension crackling in the air. "You're bluffing," James said, but his voice quavered. "Am I?" I raised an eyebrow. "Why don't we wait about—" I checked my watch. 30 minutes and find out? That's when Agent Daniel Harris and his team will be arriving with arrest warrants for you, James, for insurance fraud, and for you, Richard, for securities fraud and money laundering. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Mom, stop this. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me. Embarrassing you? I looked at her in disbelief. You pretended not to know your own mother at your wedding, and you're worried about being embarrassed? You don't understand, she hissed. You never understood what it takes to be part of this world. No, I didn't, I agreed. Because I was too busy teaching you right from wrong, a lesson that clearly didn't take. Victoria rose as well, her composure cracking for the first time. Richard, we need to leave, now. No one is leaving, I said firmly. The FBI has the country club under surveillance, but you still have time to do one decent thing. I turned to Sarah. I turned to Cho. Tell your daughter the truth. Tell her what she's really married into. Richard and James exchanged a look. Then Richard sighed and seemed to deflate slightly. Sarah, he said, his voice suddenly old and tired, there are certain financial realities that we haven't been completely transparent about. What are you talking about? Sarah looked between her new father-in-law and her husband, confusion etched on her face. The Westfield fortune isn't what it used to be, Richard admitted. We've been managing appearances for years. James's insurance claims were a necessity, a way to maintain our lifestyle without selling assets or admitting to the world that we're not as solvent as we once were. That's what you call fraud? Managing appearances? I shook my head in disgust. You don't understand the pressure, James burst out. The expectations. Everyone thinks we're still one of Boston's premier families. Do you know what would happen if people knew the truth? We'd be nothing. So instead, you committed federal crimes, I said flatly, and dragged my daughter into your mess. Sarah sank slowly back into her chair, her face ashen. James, is this true? Did you really file false insurance claims? He couldn't meet her eyes. It wasn't like that. It was just creative financing. Everyone does it. Everyone does not commit fraud, I said firmly. Most people live within their means, or work harder when they need more. They don't fake accidents and file false claims. Sarah turned to me, her expression a mixture of shock, betrayal, and dawning horror. Did you know? Before the wedding? Is that why you're doing this now? I only discovered it yesterday, I said more gently. During the reception. If I'd known sooner. I trailed off. What would I have done? Tried to stop the wedding? Would she have believed me? And now what happens? Sarah asked, her voice small. Now the FBI arrests James, Richard, and possibly Victoria for their roles in these crimes. They'll be prosecuted. And you... I hesitated. You'll need to prove you weren't involved, that you didn't know. Which she didn't, Victoria said quickly. Sarah knew nothing about any of this. I looked at my daughter, searching her face. Is that true? Did you really not know anything? Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, guilt, but she shook her head. I didn't know about the insurance claims or shell companies, but she swallowed hard. I knew they wanted to keep you away from the wedding, away from their business associates. They said it was because of your background, but I should have questioned why it mattered so much. The door to the restaurant opened and Daniel Harris entered, flanked by several agents in suits. Right on time. Richard Westfield, James Westfield, he announced formally. You're under arrest for insurance fraud, wire fraud, and securities fraud. What followed was controlled chaos. The agents moved efficiently through the room, reading rights, placing handcuffs on Richard and James, instructing the shocked guests to remain seated and calm. Through it all, Sarah sat motionless, watching her new husband and father-in-law being led away in handcuffs. Victoria, after a brief, hushed conversation with one of the agents, was allowed to remain, though I suspected her involvement would be investigated as well. The brunch guests were questioned briefly and then released. The Westfields' closest friends suddenly had urgent appointments elsewhere, disappearing with muttered excuses and averted eyes. Within an hour, the room had emptied except for Sarah, Victoria, and me. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "Now you get a lawyer," I said. "A good one, not connected to the Westfields. You need someone who will look out for your interests, not theirs." "Why are you helping me?" She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "After everything I did, everything I said, why would you want to help me?" I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold and limp in mine, but she didn't pull away. "Because I'm your mother," I said simply. "That doesn't change, even when you pretend it has." 7 days passed before I heard from Sarah again. 7 days of news reports about the Westfield fraud scandal. 7 days of my phone ringing with calls from reporters who discovered I was the mother of the bride who had married into disaster. 7 days of wondering if my daughter would ever forgive me for exposing the truth, even though I knew I'd done the right thing. When my doorbell rang on that 7th day, I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Sarah standing on my porch, still wearing her going-away outfit from the honeymoon that never happened, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, her voice broken with genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry for everything. Can I please come home?" I opened my arms and my daughter fell into them like she was 7 years old again. But real reconciliation isn't as simple as an embrace on a doorstep. The weeks that followed were difficult, filled with painful conversations and hard truths. Sarah moved back into her childhood bedroom while the FBI investigation continued. James was released on bail pending trial, but the terms of his release prevented him from contacting Sarah directly. The Westfield assets were frozen. The mansion was seized. Victoria was charged as an accessory after the fact, and my daughter was left to rebuild her life from the rubble of her choices. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she admitted one evening as we sat at the kitchen table, cups of tea growing cold between us. "I spent so long trying to become someone the Westfields would accept that I lost myself completely." "You're still Sarah Walker," I told her. "That hasn't changed." "But it has," she insisted. "I became Sarah Westfield. I changed the way I dressed, the way I spoke, the way I thought. I let them convince me that my background, that you, were something to be ashamed of." "Why?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me for months. Why was their approval worth more than everything we'd built together? She stared into her tea, shoulders slumped. "It wasn't just about their money, though that was part of it. It was about belonging to something established, something with history and tradition, something bigger than myself." "Our family has history too," I reminded her. "Maybe not the kind that gets written about in society pages, but real history. Your father and I. You. The life we built together and the one I continued building for you after he died." "I know that now," she said quietly. "But I forgot it somewhere along the way. Or maybe I chose to ignore it because it was easier than acknowledging what I was throwing away." Those conversations continued over many nights. Sometimes they ended in tears, sometimes in anger, occasionally in fragile laughter. But slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild what had been broken. Sarah found a job at a small marketing firm, not the prestigious position she'd had before, but honest work. She filed for annulment of her marriage, a process complicated by the ongoing criminal cases. She started therapy, working through the tangle of her choices and motivations, and I learned to trust her again, inch by careful inch. 4 months after the wedding, we were sitting on the back porch, watching fireflies rise from the garden at dusk, when Sarah asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me completely for what I did at the wedding?" I took a long time to answer, wanting to be truthful rather than simply reassuring. "I already forgive you," I said finally, "but I don't think I'll ever forget standing there while you looked through me like I was a stranger. Some hurts leave scars, even after they heal." She nodded, accepting this. "I wouldn't be able to forgive me if I were you." "That's the thing about a mother's love," I told her. "It's not conditional on deserving it. But that doesn't mean the hurt wasn't real." "I think about it every day," she admitted. "That moment, the look on your face, how I could have done that to the person who gave me everything." "Why did you do it?" I asked. Not the broader reasons, the Westfields, the social climbing, but in that specific moment, how could you pretend not to know me? Sarah was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid. Victoria had been drilling into me for months that everything had to be perfect, that their friends would be judging every detail. When I saw you there, in that navy dress instead of the designer outfit she'd suggested you buy, looking so out of place among all that wealth, I panicked. I thought if I acknowledged you, everyone would see that I didn't really belong in their world. So you chose them over me?" "Yes." A tear slid down her cheek. "It was the worst decision of my life, and I'll spend the rest of my days trying to make it up to you." "You don't need to make it up to me," I said, reaching for her hand. "You just need to find your way back to yourself. The real Sarah, not the one the Westfields tried to create." The legal proceedings dragged on for nearly a year. James eventually accepted a plea deal, as did Richard. Victoria was given probation. The Westfield name, once synonymous with old Boston money and social prominence, became associated with fraud and deception, and Sarah and I rebuilt our relationship, stronger in the broken places. On the 1-year anniversary of the disastrous wedding, Sarah brought me breakfast in bed. Blueberry pancakes, my favorite. "What's the occasion?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well. "I want to replace the memory," she said, setting the tray across my lap. "I want this day to mean something different for us going forward." After breakfast, she handed me a small box. Inside was a pendant, a silver tree with delicate branches spreading outward. "It's a family tree," she explained as she helped me fasten it around my neck, "to remind me that the only family legacy that matters is the one we create through love, not money or social status." "It's beautiful," I said, touching it gently. "I'm thinking of going back to school," she told me as we sat together on the edge of the bed. "Maybe law school. I want to help people who've been victims of fraud, like the people you've worked with all these years." I smiled at the irony. Full circle. "I've been thinking a lot about foundations," she continued. "What we build our lives on. The Westfields built theirs on appearances and deception, and look how quickly it all collapsed. You built ours on hard work and honesty. It weathered even my worst betrayal. Some bridges can be rebuilt," I told her, "if both people are willing to do the work. It just takes the right foundation of honesty, forgiveness, and love that doesn't come with conditions attached." Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, just as she used to do as a child. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Mom, even when I gave up on myself." Outside, the morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting dappled light across the room. A new day, a second chance, a family rebuilt, stronger than before, Some might say I should have walked away after such a painful rejection. But true love, the kind that survives betrayal and humiliation, doesn't disappear with a single wound, no matter how deep. It persists, it heals, it forgives, and sometimes when we're lucky, it brings us home again.